Let's just jump right into this explainer, because we're tackling one of the absolute biggest questions out there right now. Are we, right this second, entering a Cold War 2.0 with Russia and China? We're going to unpack the current global landscape, stack it up against historical tensions, and most importantly, we're going to separate the flashy media buzzwords from what's actually happening on the ground.
But hey, before we go slapping catchy labels on things, we need to anchor ourselves with a brilliant warning from H.L. Mencken. He said, "For every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." And wow, does that apply here? The dynamic between the US, Russia, and China is like a giant, high-stakes puzzle. It's so tempting to just slap that Cold War sticker on it and call it a day. But as our source material reminds us, doing that might give us an answer that's clear, simple, and totally wrong. We've got to dig a little deeper.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll define what a Cold War actually is. Then, we'll examine this new terminology. Third, we'll track Russia's grand rebuild-up, followed by China's superpower ascendancy. And finally, we'll look at why all of this matters to you right now.
All right, Section 1, defining a Cold War, its history and meaning. Because, let's face it, we can't really understand the sequel if we don't understand the original, right?
Looking back, between 1944 and 1991, the globe was essentially split right down the middle between two massive superpowers, the US and the USSR. We had the blue regions, representing NATO and US allies, and then the red regions, mapping out the Warsaw Pact and Soviet-aligned nations. It was a fiercely bipolar world, wrapped in this overarching tension that literally touched almost every single continent.
The absolutely crucial takeaway here is in the actual definition. A Cold War is a conflict over ideological differences, carried on by methods that stop just short of sustained, overt military action, what we call a hot war. And critically, this usually happens without breaking off diplomatic relations. It's this simmering standoff, a constant, tense game of chess where both sides are desperately trying to outmaneuver one another without actually pulling the ultimate trigger.
Moving right along to Section 2, the new terminology. We have to figure out, is Cold War 2.0 actually the right fit for today, or is it just a convenient media buzzword?
Here's the fascinating thing. Commentators have been predicting a new Cold War for decades now. I mean, look at this. As early as 1955, barely a decade into the original, people were already talking about a return to it. From Nixon meeting Mao in the 70s, to counterterrorism shifts in 2001, right up to 2016 when the term really gained traction again. This shows us that this specific anxiety isn't entirely new. It's kind of our default reaction whenever global stress spikes.
Because of all that historical baggage, our source material contrasts a Cold War with something called great power competition. Now what's that? Well, it involves rival nations with massive global reach just vying to be the absolute top dog in international politics. The distinction here is subtle, but it's massive. Great power competition doesn't inherently demand an existential, ideological fight to the death, where one side has to be completely destroyed. It can just be a ruthless, ongoing rivalry for economic clout, influence, and regional control.
So, with those terms demystified, we have to ask ourselves the million-dollar question. Which of these two frameworks best describes the world today? Are the US, China, and Russia locked in a bitter ideological Cold War? Or are they just massive global powers aggressively competing for the #1 spot on the leaderboard?
That brings us to Section 3, Russia's grand rebuild-up, tracing the actions. To really answer our question, we need to objectively map out Russia's behavior over the last few decades. When you look closely, a really clear, consistent pattern starts to emerge, what the source refers to as Russia's grand rebuild-up. We see a strong willingness to use overt military force on a regional level. It started with Dagestan and Chechnya in the 90s, moved into Georgia in 2008, and as we all know, culminated in the annexations and invasions of Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. But it actually goes way beyond their immediate borders. We see their footprint stretching into Syria in 2015 and deep into Africa, places like the Central African Republic, Mali, and Burkina Faso right up to 2024. And of course, capping all of that off is their massive deployment of cyber and propaganda tools, like we saw during the 2016 elections.
Now, the international response to all of this has been pretty stark. And just to put it in perspective, when the UN voted on a resolution to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, a whopping 141 nations voted in favor of the condemnation. Only 5 voted against, with 34 abstentions. It's a very visual representation of exactly how the broader international community views this specific side of the new geopolitical competition.
Let's pivot to Section 4, China's superpower ascendancy, strategic growth. Because China's approach to this global competition, it looks completely different from Russia's.
Unlike Russia's very overt, boots-on-the-ground military tactics, China's superpower ascendancy leans heavily into sweeping economic initiatives and insanely rapid technological growth. They are leveraging the massive Belt and Road Initiative, locking down global trade deals, and pouring just staggering amounts of investment into Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But listen, don't mistake this for purely an economic play. Not at all. They now boast the largest navy in the entire world, they have a growing nuclear stockpile, and they are making major, world-leading advancements in both AI and cyber capabilities. It is the whole shebang.
And crucially, so much of China's great power competition with the US is happening entirely invisibly. It's unfolding out of sight in the digital realm, in the breakneck race for AI dominance, and through economic leverage. It's this sleek, modern, high-tech rivalry that doesn't really look anything like the traditional military standoffs we saw in the 20th century, which is exactly why slapping that old Cold War label on it can feel, a bit clunky.
Which brings us to our final section, why this matters now, the global implications. We've gone through the definitions and the actions, but let's get real. Why should all these global shifts matter to you and me right now? Well, first off, we have to look at the shifting map of alliances. Are Russia and China actually allies in the traditional sense? And what about their ties with nations like Iran, North Korea, and Syria? We're forced to ask ourselves if they're forming a true, unified allied bloc, kind of like the Warsaw Pact of the past, or are they just sharing common adversaries and working together out of pure convenience? Figuring out that distinction is absolutely key to understanding the exact threat level we're dealing with globally.
The source material lays out exactly why this should be on our radar. These massive power shifts have direct, real-world consequences on our daily lives. We're looking at growing global instability. Think about it. For many of us, we've literally never lived in a world where the US wasn't the sole, uncontested superpower. This brand new reality brings wildly unpredictable impacts on the global and specifically the US economy. Furthermore, as these rival nations gain more influence, we're seeing the global rise and spread of authoritarianism, and that directly leads to increased threats to our privacy and civil liberties all over the world. This isn't just some distant political theory, it impacts our wallets, our data, and our fundamental rights.
All of this prompts a genuinely heavy question posed by our source. Is our current situation actually worse than Cold War 1.0? Think about it. During the original Cold War, the world was heavily divided, sure, but the economic systems of the US and the Soviets were largely isolated from one another. Fast forward to today, and the US and Chinese economies are so deeply, intricately tangled together. If things go south now, the economic fallout wouldn't just be bad, it would be unprecedented.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought from the explainer. As we navigate this incredibly complex new era, whether you want to call it Cold War 2.0 or great power competition, what exact trigger would push the world from a cold strategic conflict into a devastating hot war? Is it Taiwan? Is it a massive cyber attack? An economic blockade? Understanding the rules of this new geopolitical game is the only way we can ensure we don't accidentally stumble into the worst-case scenario.